Hi everyone, this is Kesselraptorial. So yesterday I was able to find this article. I promised I would do more research on this. In the international scientific journal Ecotoxicology. It's published in 2008, but most of the additional research and more recent articles that I've found on this topic do line up with what is described here, so it does check out. The article is titled Harmful Algal Toxins of the Florida Red Tide Karenia Brevis, Natural Chemical Stressors in South Florida Coastal Ecosystems. I will put a link to the article, of course, in the description. You can find it yourself. This talks about and answers a lot of questions. I did have to go a few other places for some branch information, but this explains why the red tides of this microorganism, this Karenia Brevis, that we're seeing in Florida waters and on the Texas coast, in the Gulf of Mexico waters, are so dangerous. Why they are, why this red tide is resulting in so many marine life deaths, and actually why it's extremely dangerous to humans as well. So we will get into it. So the microbe of which this red tide we are seeing in the Florida and Gulf waters goes by the scientific name of Karenia Brevis. Here is a picture again of what this microorganism looks like under the microscope. It is a photosynthesizing algae, and you may ask, if it gets its energy from photosynthesis like plants do, why is it red and not green? That's a fair question. Green photosynthesizers, like plants and cyanobacteria, are green because of the green chloroplasts in their cells. Chloroplasts are the structures that take in sunlight and produce energy. In plants and cyanobacteria, the chloroplasts are green because of the green pigment chlorophyll. There are algae with red chloroplasts, however. They have a different chlorophyll pigment which can be bright red, purplish or pinkish color, so it's a different variety. So that confirms that Karenia Brevis can indeed be both a photosynthetic algae and be red in color. As to the toxin, it is a substance produced by the algae microbes either as a metabolic product or as a defensive measure. The toxin, called a brevetoxin, that in large concentrations causes neurological and immune system damage in marine life. Seen as it can cause this damage in mammals, it is not hard to deduce that it can also cause that type of damage in humans. And because neurological and immune system damage is extremely destructive, I'd say this is a pretty good reason to stay out of the Gulf of Mexico waters, actually. Those are not very repairable types of damage, and what can be done is not easy to undergo. Photosynthetic organisms, such as plants and photosynthetic bacteria, and I should point out something about algae. Algae is a term that is an kind of informal umbrella classification that includes a wide range of aquatic, usually photosynthesizing organisms that resemble plants, but not all algae are plants. So in scientific classification, algae would be considered a polyphyletic group, and I actually cannot find a definitive classification of Karenia Brevis. Even a dinoflagellate could be either plant or bacteria. Either way, what does an organism need to photosynthesize in terms of base environmental factors? It needs carbon dioxide, it needs water, and it needs nutrients. Think of land plants, which have carbon dioxide exhaled from animals and other creatures all around them. They will die without water, so land plants are most numerous and successful in wet environments, and they get nutrients from the soil. Where do aquatic plants and photosynthetic bacteria and plankton get their nutrients? In the water? Well, from nutrients emptied into the water from the land. Largely, there are nutrients from the deep ocean that are brought up to the surface waters by ocean currents, but when there's a whole bunch of extra nutrients coming from the land, like, say, from fertilizers and chemicals, that will feed algal blooms in the numbers of algae in the water. So, all of this information and research, so far, confirms that every time there are extra nutrients, extra minerals and metals and chemicals going into the ocean because of increased erosion from the land because there were widespread fires or widespread plant removal, which means vegetation is no longer holding the soil in place, or there's a lot of agricultural chemicals and fertilizer being used all over the land, and overloading the hydrology, the bodies of water, the groundwater, and all of that eventually ends up in the ocean. A lot of trash being dumped into the water, or, worst case scenario, all of the above. All of that is going to feed the microorganisms that grow in the water, especially during the warmer months when algal blooms tend to peak. Scientists from multiple fields have been talking about this for decades. I know because there were easy-to-read articles, well, relatively as scientific articles go, and there were articles for more average reader, but even when I was in elementary school, which means the research was out there already. I have found little to no real evidence, or at least, reliable evidence, that this red tide of Karenia Brevis is strongly linked to increasing temperatures tied to global warming. That doesn't seem to be what's fueling this expansion in red tide. The Florida waters have been a hotspot for algal blooms for centuries, and regardless of how high the water temperature becomes, you'll still need the food, those extra nutrients, those extra minerals in the water for the algae to grow. The excessive minerals are a key factor here, and as was mentioned, the type of bodily damage that this organism, this Karenia Brevis' toxins produces is not a joke. Respiratory irritation, organ and immune system damage in high concentrations. This is risk enough maybe to stay out of the Gulf waters and away from also eating the local seafood of that region as well, at the very least until the red tide recedes, because the toxins have likely been in the bodies of the marine creatures for some time, and these are toxins that can bioaccumulate. I don't mean to advertise withdrawing from what drives a lot of the business in that region lightly, but this is pretty serious danger. And I think we might want to take some closer looks at what has been going into those waters and in what amounts. Think of this huge red tide as nature's way of saying, hey, let this be a lesson to you. You might want to start paying a lot more attention to how your water and oceans are managed.